Hello, everyone. My name is Jax West, and I run Stephen Avery Project. And I'm coming on a little bit early so we can try and get things set up. And hopefully there won't be any kinks, knock on wood, for our discussion tonight with John Ferak. Hold on, I just went live now. Hello, Jules. Oops, I'm trying to message John because he said he was on the Facebook page. Hello, Dave. So what we'll be doing here is John Ferak will be joining me on this live discussion. The screen will be a split screen, and I'd be on one side and he'd be on the other, but please ignore me. I'm just here. Oh, hold on, he's messaging me. Make sure your phone or tablet is in landscape. You just request to join the feed and I accept, and you're in. Oh, I always was hitting enter for our thinking it was going to go. So anyway, okay, so let me get back to the instructions while I'm also on this computer trying to instruct John on how to get on here. So John will be on here just like lives that I do in our MAM gossip. Oh, sure. Sorry. And see, and this is why I'm trying to go a little early so we can, get this figured out, because now he just said that he's on his laptop, but this Facebook Live thing only works if you're using a tablet or a cell phone. Okay, so he says no problem. So just like we do in any of the other lives that we do, I'm responding to him over here. You'll be able to type out your questions that come up like is going right now. And John will be able to pick whatever he wants to answer. Please keep your questions only pertinent to his book. And since we're doing this on Stephen Avery Project, where we have, such a huge following, your questions will scroll by very fast if there's so many people asking questions. So you can resubmit the same question. Don't just keep doing it, wait a few and then then submit it again. If anybody comes on here that's just trying to goof off or whatever, we're going to get rid of you, So the discussion tonight is with John Ferak, who wrote the book Wrecking Crew that just came out a couple weeks ago. And you can get a copy of the book on Amazon. And you could get it electronic too. I read it in one night, the night that it came out. Well, Jade, no, this is Q&A with John Ferak, who wrote the book Wrecking Crew that's all about Stephen's case. So he really had some very interesting new information in that book. So, and he was a Wisconsin journalist at the time of Stephen's case, so he's done a lot of articles on this case over the years, and he knows a lot about it, and he's gone to the salvage yard and all that, so he's somebody that's very knowledgeable in the case, and we're very lucky to have him. He'll be on shortly. He's getting his charger for his phone, since it has to be through his phone. So, and then he'll be taking questions for about an hour. And, he'll let you know that, this is the last question, and that will be that. We really appreciate him taking his time out to talk to everybody. And then we've got, while we're waiting for John, there's Kathleen Zellner. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by reading people's stuff too. Kathleen Zellner will be filing for Stephen on Thursday next week, the December 20th. So that will be a big day. We will post the brief as soon as possible. We'll also be doing a live to be going over what we see in there. Every time Kathleen files a brief, there'll be new information in there. So we're going to learn stuff that we didn't know. Okay. Okay, he says he's on here now. Let me see. There. Okay. I saw I had to set the settings so he could request to be a part of this. So, and bear with us, because this is the first time that we're doing this split screen here. I see somebody else just requested. Oh, I can only have one person on here besides me. So please, nobody else request other than John Ferak. So, hey, stop! Sorry, my dogs are barking as I'm trying to do it. I don't know, somebody else just did, and I have to deny you. Sorry about my dogs barking. So, oh, these dogs. Sorry. So I'm just waiting for John's request. Oh, don't worry about the mistake, Marshall. How did you do it to request it? Okay, because now John just says trying to request. So, Marshall, can you instruct John on what he has to do to request? Thank you, Cindy, for that. Now somebody else just requested, but not John, so deny that one. Yes, John Ferak, the author of the new book, Wrecking Crew, on the Stephen Avery case. Okay. Click on him to invite him. Let me see if I can go back here. No, it doesn't let me invite him by clicking on him here. Now here's somebody else asking. So other people are figuring it out. But we need John on here. And another one. Somebody please instruct me. What do you see when you're clicking on to request? They're saying the green button. The green circle besides the chat box, John. Do you see that, John? I keep getting all these other people requesting to be in the video. Beside the comment space, there is a green button. I'm kidding. Please nobody else request. I just need John to request. I keep Xing, off the other people. Let's see. Yeah, that's why I wanted to come on a little early and try and get this figured out. John is saying there's no green button on his end. People are saying go out and then go back in. Let's see. Sorry, we're getting this figured out. There you are, John. There you are.
We figured this out.
So there'll be a little delay between you and I talking, but like I said, I'm not going to be talking. It's just going to be you. So you'll read, see people's questions on the bottom. And just pick and choose whatever you want to answer and ignore the ones you don't.
Gotcha. Okay. And do I do it verbal? I don't have to type these answers, right?
No, you don't have to type. You just talk.
Perfect. Oh, this will be great. Okay, gotcha. So I'll see where you are right now. Then I'll see questions, and then I tell you which ones to go with, or which.
You just look at them.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. Hold on. I'm gonna fix the background a little bit because this will. I like this better than yeah. Once I got out and got back in, then it was totally fine. But if nobody would have said to get out and get back in, we would still be hitting our head on the wall. So
I know technology. It's trying to figure it out. So yeah, right now we just have people all saying hello, but I've told them, to ask you questions about your book, and I want to say thank you so much for your book. I found it, as somebody who has followed the case for a while, I mean, you had so much in there. I thought it was fabulous.
Oh, thank you. Are we live? And we got everybody live right now at this second, correct?
Yes, we are live. There's currently 266 on here.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, yeah, and it'll scroll really fast too. People have been told to resubmit because their questions will go by so fast that you won't see them. But somebody
Gotcha.
said, could you introduce yourself and tell people about yourself and what your background is with the case?
Gotcha. Okay. So anyway, myself, I'm from Illinois, and I'm back in Illinois now, and I lived in Wisconsin 2 different times in my life as well. I was in Wisconsin in Green Bay from 2000 through 2003. So when I was in my mid to late 20s, I worked at the newspaper in Green Bay, and then it was out in Omaha, Nebraska, for a little over 9 years, and did a lot of investigative reporting out there, and actually did a lot of covered some really interesting, noteworthy murder cases out there as well. And actually, that was the case that gave me my first book that I ever did, which was about an individual who was a lot like Brendan Dassey, as I talked about last week, except he was about 10 years older than Brendan. But he was put in basically the same situation as Brendan, except in that case, though, the police were yelling at him and screaming at him, whereas obviously people know Fassbender and Uyghur, they kind of took the father figure approach with Brendan, tapping him on his arm and that kind of stuff. Whereas these guys kind of took the opposite approach, where they basically beat the individual down mentally, and after like 100 and some denials that he had nothing to do with the murder, he eventually just agreed to a set of right or wrong questions that one of the dopey sheriff's investigators had put together to get him to make a false confession. And what's really interesting too in that case is that Steve Drizin got involved in that case, and that's actually how I first met Steve Drizin. Was, like I said, probably it was 2006. It was summer of 2006, and Steve tracked me down. He had read several of my stories about the case, and Steve was convinced, and he knew the stuff inside and out. He was convinced just from reading the case that he could tell this was a false confession. So luckily in that case, for everybody here, I mean, as much as Kratz, and a lot of people here think that he's, the scum of the earth and stuff like that. In the case in Nebraska, the opposite kind of happened. There was the small town prosecutor decided to go against the grain, and he stopped the case, in the middle of the prosecution, and decided to drop the murder case against the 2 individuals that were sitting in jail, because he realized now, 6 or 7 months into the case, that the wrong people had been arrested by the local sheriff's department, and I know that pissed off the sheriff's investigators. I mean, and their office was similar to Manitowoc County. It's like the courthouse is right in the middle of the downtown in the square, and the police department's right next door to it. So it's kind of interesting how those things turn out. But so that prosecutor in a small town had a lot of pressure on him, because the cops were furious at him for dropping charges in the middle of the case. They held a press conference, the day after they made the arrests of Matt Livers and Nick Sampson, his cousin. And here you got the local prosecutor deciding 6-8 months into the case to drop the case against these guys and stuff like that. So it really took a lot of guts, but it also shows that there are a lot of good prosecutors out there, and not every single small town prosecutor is a guy like Ken Kratz, where it's win at all costs. If we got to cheat to win, a few times even, we'll do it, stuff like that. So anyway, that's a little background about me being out of state. Getting back to Wisconsin, end of 2012 was about this time 6 years ago. I moved back to Wisconsin. I took a position on the investigative team. I worked as an editor for a few years, and then we kind of did some reshuffling, decided we don't even need an editor anymore, and I moved back to being a reporter, which is what I like to do anyway. And Making a Murder comes out end of 2015, 3 years ago basically, and I had an editor at that point in time that was really gung-ho about the case and really wanted to look into it, and basically gave me permission, to do whatever I needed to as far as investigative reporting, but kind of do a lot of in-depth stories about the case. And I was fresh. I didn't really know. I mean, everybody had heard of Stephen Avery, and Brenda Dassey, but I was gone in Omaha, Nebraska, all those years that this case was when it was going on, 05, 06, and 07 and stuff. So I really came into this case kind of, I mean, very fresh, but also very, naive. But I also thought that I didn't come in there with the baggage that some of the Wisconsin journalists that have been covering the case for years, and it's kind of like, oh, they got to be guilty because Ken Kratz said he is, and I watched Ken Kratz's press conference, and so I didn't have any of that kind of baggage or anything like that then. So.
Okay. So why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I'm trying to think here for background. I would say May of 2016 was my last book that I had done, and that was on the biggest wrongful conviction case in the country, and it actually was a case out of Nebraska. I had not covered it, but it was going on at the same time as this case I was just telling you about. So I wrote Failure of Justice. That came out in May of 2016. And so now you're talking about 5 or 6 months after Making a Murder had come out. And my thoughts were that I thought the Avery case at some point in time and the Dassey case would definitely lend itself to another book. But I wanted to make sure that the another book was going to be a book that was different, that was unique, and something that hadn't been done before. And I didn't want to rehash anything that, and I certainly didn't want to, go the same angle of some of the other individuals, that they had done and stuff. So I thought putting the book together kind of from the standpoint of chronicling, the defense, the case, as how it's being pieced together by Zellner, again, similar to me, whereas she was, fresh to the case. She comes into the case brand new, in January of 2016. She doesn't know any of the key players, from the case. And so I really wanted the book to be something that would be of interest to people like you and people that are on the live feed tonight and stuff like that. I'm sure, there are people that will get the book or have gotten the book that don't know the case inside and out. But given the fact that there's so many millions of people that are interested in the case, I wanted to do something from a standpoint of here's something you could sit down and read, and it's put together in a kind of a story type of format, whereas it's all there, but I tried my best to really present the story in a way that's a free-flowing narrative, that it's, I hope it's a page turner, and if people are moving from chapter to chapter, then I feel successful. Then that means they are. But I wanted to do it in a way because, as we all know here, there's been tens of thousands of documents that have been filed just since Zellner's been on the case. Okay. But to then be able to go through and try to cherry pick, so to speak, as far as, okay, these 3 or 4 paragraphs or this page here and this page here, trying to put that all together into a little ball, and lay it out for people as far as, no, this isn't, just, a lawyer that's getting involved in the case for publicity's sake at all. This is someone that really believes in the case, believes in the cause, not just for Steve, but also for Brendan too. And this is a key point as well. I think that, as we know now, I think if Steve Avery's case is successful, if Zellner's successful with that, I think that that'll ultimately lead to Brendan's case being reversed, and thrown out as well. And so the stakes are a lot higher for Zellner now because of the way that the case turned out with the goofy ruling out of Chicago, the 4-3 ruling that went against Brendan, in the end, unfortunately, and stuff like that. So, but again, I wanted the story to be told using the documents, the legal documents, but try to present it in a way that you'd step away from the book, from Wrecking Crew, and kind of be like, oh my gosh, it's not just one little thing that she's after. There's a dozen things, and she's still working on the case as we're probably having this conversation right now here on a Thursday night on December 13th. And that's the interesting thing about Zellner, is that she doesn't quit. She's constantly thinking things through, and there might be some forensic testing that she'll do next week or the week after, or somebody that hasn't come forward yet that'll call her office or email her office, a week from now. So anyway.
What is your theory?
What is my theory as far as like who did it, or well, let me
Yeah,
go
what
back a
really
little.
happened?
Well, I go back. I mean, I spent a lot of time on this over the last 3 years, and I kind of bounced around too. But I also remember kind of, you know, taking consideration from, from Buting and Strang, talking to Pete Bates over the years, who was an original Making Murder, and then also trying to study as far as, what makes sense, what's logical, and if it is this person, if I'm going to work off of the theory that it's Ryan Hilgis or Scott Blodorn, or George Zipper, or Brad Check, or the German, stuff like, I'm naming them all, but those are all people that we've all had conversations about, Bobby, and Scott and stuff like that. The thing then you have to come back and say to yourself is then, how does it happen? Where does it happen? And then, how are they able to get away with it and stuff like that? And the one thing that I kept always coming back to as far as looking at some of the people outside, and the people on the outside would be like your George Zippers, your Bradley Checks, your Ryan Hilgis, your Scott Blodorns, those kinds of individuals. The one thing that I think kind of distances them in my mind is the location, because especially for me being out at Avery's and being out at that area several times, you really have to have some familiarity with the roads out there and stuff like that. Okay. And that's a lot different than just, some of these other kind of cases and stuff. So I really kind of fall back to the possibility that whoever harmed Teresa has to be somebody that has some general familiarity with the lay of the land, with that area, because of the other possibility that after the crime happens, there's also a good chance that the killer, or an accomplice or both, is also going to be involved in planting evidence, moving the vehicle, or putting blood in the car and stuff like that. I mean, so for that stuff to kind of happen, I think you have to have some familiarity, with the area. And especially I think that's true with the bones. If the bones were planted at the burn pit, I mean, you got the two scenarios. And the one that I mentioned in my book, Wrecking Crew, kind of goes back to Pete Bates's old thoughts, his theory about, Bear the dog, that Bear is a vicious junkyard dog kind, and that he would probably go after, any stranger, and any stranger would, in my mind, would qualify as a cop. It would be you, me, it would be, the Hilgises of the world, any of those other people I mentioned, but people that would be familiar with the Bear, which would be pretty much anybody in the Avery family and everybody in the Dassey family, from Brendan to Bobby, I mean, to Barb, I mean, everybody. But basically, the dog wouldn't go crazy, wouldn't go nuts if it's somebody that was familiar to the dog. And we know, as I talked about a little bit last week, we know that there's bones that were in Brendan Dassey, I'm sorry, Bobby Dassey's burn barrel, okay? I mean, that's the one key important fact that sometimes gets overlooked because, prosecution doesn't want people to remember that. But that's one of the most important facts of this whole case. So if you work off of the theory that there's some bones still at the bottom of that barrel, then logic would tell you that it also makes sense that one individual or two individuals rolled that barrel 50 or 60 yards or whatever the distance is between Barb's place and Steve's backyard. Okay, and they dump some of those bones out at night, while the dog's still out there and stuff like that. So I just think it's a lot less likely that a Scott, a Ryan, a George Zipper, any of those other people would have been able to pull something like that off, under those circumstances and stuff like that. So, I mean, at this point in time, I mean, I'm open to change this like I have over time, but I still, at this point in time, I think that Bobby, and Scott look like the two, best people, if you're in Zellner's shoes, to be focused in on and stuff like that. Because again, the proximity to the location of where this happened. And the one obvious thing, you have Bobby saying that he's watching her, that he's observing her at the time that she goes missing. Think about Ryan Ferguson's case, right? Yeah, Ryan Ferguson out of Columbia, Missouri, one of Zellner's best exoneration cases, okay? I mean, the individual that she believes that she's always contended committed that crime was a sports copy editor at that newspaper named Michael Boyd. Michael Boyd, same situation. He put himself exactly in the area at the scene, basically, around the same area where Ken Heitel, the sports editor, was murdered, out in the parking lot in his car that night. So, I mean, Bobby basically, just put himself in that odd situation where it's just either coincidence or unbelievable coincidence that she's pulling up to the Averys to do, her auto trader assignment, and Bobby just happens to be scoping her out, out the window and stuff like that. And he's doing such a thorough job of observing her that he's able to later tell the police exactly, what her clothes were and stuff like that. Whereas I couldn't tell you right now, even though I've seen my kids and just, took one of them home from swimming, I couldn't tell you what what they wore to school today and stuff like that. Maybe I'm absent-minded, probably, but just my point is that he paid attention to such detail. And as Zellner has pointed out, the possibility is that he paid attention to such detail because, he may have been involved, in the crime that harmed her. So,
what would you say is the thing that surprised you the most that you uncovered in researching for this book that you didn't know?
Let me think about that a little bit. Actually, it was one of the things that came up in the last several months, and we all know this, but I found that kind of a game changer, and that was the computer disk that Ken Kratz and Tom Fassbender withheld from Buting and Strang, because I think that if that disc was presented on a sheet of paper honestly and ethically, and it said what it really was, that it wasn't like Brendan Dassey's computer. We know this was Bobby Dassey's computer, and if the disc was labeled properly and given to Dean and Jerry in a reasonable time frame, because keep in mind the computer was seized at the beginning of 2006, and I think it was around April or May is when Detective Valley out of the Grand Chute Police Department finally put together his report. So, I mean, Dean and Jerry were getting dumped on. I mean, they were getting these other items, December of 2006, right on the verge of their trial. And if they would have been given that disc back in May of 2006 in a reasonable time frame, and I just from my observations of Dean and Jerry, people can say what they want, but I do think that they are top-notch attorneys and stuff like that, and I think they would have been smart enough to realize that, kind of have an oh my gosh moment that, hey, this is what we needed to get our Denny, this is the one item that we needed to kind of spend time probing Bobby Dassey and stuff like that, and really delving into, his behavior on the computer and all these other things. But as we now know, that thing gets dumped on them 7 months, later. And the way the whole report is worded is just, it's just very unethical. And you could tell it's done that way, by a couple of individuals that, we all pretty much believe, are unethical and shady and would do that kind of stuff. So that's just, you asked me about what's the most important thing. And I think that piece of evidence could be, the key item, beside the key that is, but the key item besides the spare key, found on the floor, but that could overturn Avery's conviction on appeal from a Brady violation standpoint. Because again, just from a fairness standpoint and exculpatory evidence standpoint, if Dean and Jerry had that in a timely fashion, I think that they would have been able to put on a strong case even back in 2006, 2007. Forget about all the people Zellner's brought in, but just they would have been smart enough to really hone in on Bobby Dassey, and rather than when they went into the court, not basically having both their arms tied behind their back, by Ken Kratz and Tom Fassbender. So, there's lots of other things out there that I've found interesting, but in my mind, that since that's so recent, and I think it's so, damning, that and it helpful for Steve and Brendan, that's a key point right there. So,
and what do you think about the bones, where there's everybody, the bones have never really been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they're Teresa's. Do you believe they're Teresa's? And what about the whole connection? Is it Carmen Bootwell? What do you think of the whole bone situation?
As of right now, just based on, and I did do some research on it in 2016, I think. I did some research on Carmen Bootwell, and I know at one point in time I tracked down a bunch of reports out of the city of Manitowoc related to her death and kind of who showed up at the scene and all that stuff. I mean, as of right now, at the time of this conversation, I do think that those bones are Teresa's because, again, because of the fact that there's other bones that were found burned, at the quarry at 3 different locations and in Bobby Dassey's burn barrel and stuff like that. But I still, would like to know a little bit more about, just because there's so limited number of bones that were found, in the burn pit and stuff like that. But with Bootwell, though, the one thing that I couldn't overcome as far as trying to tie some conspiracy between her, being burned basically or incinerated, at the crematorium, and somehow being, driven out there or something like that, is that was strictly a city of Manitowoc Police Department case, and I found no evidence. I found no connection as far as that anybody from county, like Remacher, Lank, Hermans, I didn't see any sign that these guys somehow were even involved, let alone came in or something like that or got access to evidence and stuff like that. So I mean, again, if there's a connection, if there's proof of that, then I would totally be open to changing my mind. But frankly, I'll be honest with you, I was kind of a little bummed out when I got my hands on those reports because I figured, I'm like, well, it would have to make sense that maybe, Colburn or somebody like that sneaked out there or was invited in, and maybe they even got involved. Like I was thinking, they're like, aha, there's a young woman just turned up dead in town, kind of scenario. But the city of Manitowoc, say what people want, they have a much better reputation than Manitowoc County does, and I just haven't seen anything where those guys were engaged in, corruption or misconduct in any of their cases. And frankly, everything I saw out of the Bootwell investigation just seemed to be kind of by the book. As far as I think she was found dead in the apartment. At least one other person slept the night there. They had been out drinking heavily the night before, and and it was in the city of Manitowoc. As far as the apartment, I think it was a second floor unit, and her family, had it and stuff like that, or she had a relative that had the lease or something like that. But as of this second, I just haven't found any connection to Bootwell, so I'm just kind of putting her on the side. It's like, well, maybe at some point in time, Zellner finds some evidence or she still pursues that. But, as of this second, I'm just kind of putting Carmen Bootwell on the side and saying, interesting, really, interesting the fact that these 2 young women are about the same age. They look similar, they may be some, related, but I just don't see anything that shows me that, somebody was taking bones out of the crematorium and, and throwing them, around the Avery salvage yard. So,
yeah. What do you think about what recently came out about the battery? What are your thoughts on the battery that was in the RAV4?
Well, yeah, and that's obviously something that came out as either I was done with the book or after the book had come out. I think it was around the same time. It was kind of, but no, I think that's really interesting. I was always kind of skeptical of the whole thing with the battery anyway, because it seemed like Fassbender, and Uyghur especially, were always kind of zeroing in on that when they were interviewing Brendan, which basically, it's one of those things that, again, defies logic as far as like a normal crime. I mean, nobody that commits a murder somehow, I mean, forget about who the killer is, or convicted of the crime, but those things just don't happen where somebody goes out, dumps a vehicle, and then they also, disconnect a battery cable and stuff like that, and then lock the vehicle, for the cops to find it like a locked vehicle with their own blood in it. So that thing always just kind of smelled bad to me, but I also didn't know the facts, and I still don't, know them either. But the one thing that I always found was kind of interesting is just that, it's Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, so we already know that they have a bad reputation. They have a reputation for corruption, and there's a lot of cases around the country, where there's cops, and tow truck drivers that get indicted years later by the feds, or the FBI for corruption. A lot of times it deals with shady business deals like kickbacks and stuff like that, because something we're not thinking about, but it's important to think about. But I mean, it's your tax dollars at work. But if you're a tow truck driver, and you have a contract as far as like, taking vehicles that from a DUI, or abandoned vehicles and stuff like that. There's a potential for a lot of money there, but there's also potential too for money being, you know, um, envelopes being passed around just to make sure that you're the tow truck company that gets those kinds of contracts, and or that you're the one that's constantly called. So I was always intrigued by, I always wondered about, those tow trucks that, if this case was corruption, and it certainly looks like it, then doesn't it make sense that the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office or Calumet County Sheriff's Office is going to bring in a tow truck driver to remove the RAV4 in Steve's vehicle and any other vehicle they needed to in this case? That's also going to be kind of a shady, type of, business operator and stuff like that. So that whole notion of whoever moved the RAV4, or could disassemble the battery cable, for example, and stuff like that. I always wondered about, is this somebody that has a long time relationship, with Rob Herman or Todd Herman or Tom Kasorek or Kenny Peterson and stuff like that, and would they be the kind of person, that would be willing to go along, or, know that if they did this, and kept their mouth shut, that's something, it would be good for them business wise, or, or in the community and stuff like that. So if you could actually do me a favor, because I haven't been able to keep up on all the threads, constantly, last few weeks or so, bring me up to speed as far as like, what's the latest as far as that we've firmly established related to the battery cable thing. I'm sorry, with the battery.
Well, what is being said about the battery is that it came out of Crown Vic.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
And that Colborne had checked one out. At the sheriff's department. And then there is also the thing with a witness seeing a white Jeep and people saying that Colborne had a white Jeep at that time.
Interesting. Okay. Well, and I know that Colborne had a lot of older vehicles. I mean, he collected those 1950s Plymouths and stuff like that. But like I said, I knew about the Crown Vic, but the Colborne angle, I wasn't up to speed on that. But the one thing that I always found intriguing about Colborne, kind of why I've always never really officially we talked about what I backed off with. I said I backed off of Carmen Bootwell, but I had never backed off Colborne, being intimately involved in possibly putting the vehicle, the RAV4, onto the property, because of the standpoint that he always talked about, or was forced to talk about, how he had already been a regular, so to speak, at the Avery salvage yard, when he was out there over the years, buying different parts for his other antique automobiles. And just, again, from experience from being out at Avery Salvage, I never bought the whole Pam Sturm kind of, story, as far as just you walk out there and just walk, let God tell you where to go. And lo and behold, a big, beaming light from heaven is pointing down on this vehicle and saying, this is the one. I don't think it happened that way. Most people don't. Actually, pretty much everybody doesn't. But on the flip side, the one little caveat that I always kind of found intriguing that, again, kind of got overlooked, was that Andy always talked about he had, knowledge and knew his way around out there. And I always thought, if anybody's going to be out there, whoever, I mean, if somebody was going to be involved in planting a vehicle out there, I think you have to know damn well, you got to know your way around that area, because that's kind of why I've always, again, kind of backed off some of those other people, because I think you have to know that area really well to even be able to pull something like that off. And you're just not going to do, two strangers just aren't going to go out there on Friday afternoon at 3:00 and then just kind of meander around and say, okay, let's get back together at 8:00 tonight and stuff like that. Somebody, and again, that also gets into the whole blinker light getting knocked out and stuff like that, but then being picked up and put in the back and stuff. So, but I've always, Colborne, just based on how goofy he acts, but then also kind of how sly he can be too at the same time, as far as, being so coy, and then not giving a statement about what his activities were on his day off of work. And this is something I've always said, if you were, and this was true as me as a reporter, is that when I had a super big case, I could still remember, like, going out to the scene and following up the next day, even years later now. And that was true of that case I was talking about earlier. That was my first book. I didn't go out there on the day the crime happened because I was told wrongly by the police, but there was a husband and wife that turned up dead in their farmhouse, and word got back to the newspaper that, oh, it was probably a murder suicide, and it wasn't. So I didn't go out there that day because I was told it was a murder suicide. So the very next afternoon, I busted my ass and drove an hour away to get out there, and I could still remember that to this day. So let's talk about Andy Colburn here for a second, okay? It's Thursday night, I'm getting my calendar days off. It would have been the 3rd, right? Is that right? November 3rd? Yeah. Sometimes I get those days mixed up, but I know the days of the week. It's kind of goofy. But anyway, so it's November 3rd, Thursday night, 6:30-ish or whatever. He shows up, approaches Steve, and talks to him about, Teresa being missing. Okay. All right. Then later that night, as we all know, he goes out to Zippers, or eventually, I should say, meets up at Zippers along with Detective Dennis Jacobs, along with Dave Remaker, along with John Dietering, and I'm trying to remember. I can't remember if Link actually went out there or not and stuff like that. But it was that group basically, okay. And then the rest, they go back to the sheriff's office at night. It's around 10:30, and they basically call the night, okay. All right. Either way, this is still the biggest case. It's on the news stations that night. It's the big news, the big story of Wisconsin. Teresa Hallbuck is missing. Okay, and especially in a small town agency that's strapped for people, and bodies, and experience, to work a case like that. Okay, the likelihood then that Andy, who was already going to be off that next day, isn't going to volunteer and want to get involved in helping get to the bottom of this case is crazy. Okay, so I mean, he might be a lot of goofy things, but he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy that just doesn't give a shit, about his job, and or, I mean, if his colleagues needed him, that he would somehow like turn his pager off or turn his cell phone off or whatever. I do think he'd be the kind of guy that would absolutely be willing to help out and stuff like that, and or be the kind of guy that would volunteer for that assignment and stuff like that. And so the notion that Friday, the 4th, that he's off on the calendar, that he's not going to do anything to try to help this case, or volunteer services. But then when he gets questioned right on the verge of buting and straying with the trial, he gets questioned by Gary Steer, because, by that point in time, everybody knew the evidence planting theory was going to move forward, for the trial. And Andy could recall everything he's doing that previous week. Starts with Sunday, saying it's my ritual that I always go over my mother-in-law's house, check in on her, and bring her lunch or whatever and stuff like that. He could literally tell you a year later or whatever it was, what he was doing that week. But yet when Gary Steer asks him, in a softball type of manner, asks him what he was doing on his day off on Friday the 4th, Colburn was able to get away with saying, he can't remember, and I always found that interesting because I also look at it from the other side of the coin too. Gary Steer let him get away with that too. It wasn't a case where they were trying to grill Andy and saying, look, buddy, we need to know if you're a dirty cop or not. It's the opposite. It's kind of like we're trying to do kind of what would you call it? Interference, basically, before the trial goes on. We know straying and buting are going to come after all of us. We're all going to, be thrown to the wolves here. We still think we're going to win this case, because, we have our faith in Ken Kratz and Mark Wieger and Tom Fassbender, but, the defense is going to be out there, so, we need to interview you and Jim Link, and get a statement from you guys about planting evidence and stuff like that. And so they did that. But it's interesting, and I always found that telling, that Andy Colburn was allowed to get away with saying when it counted, when push came to shove, when the rubber meets the road. He was allowed to get away with saying that he doesn't know what he was doing that day at any point in time. And Steyer put that down in his report, okay? And, and that's really when it counted. And I don't know about you, but I just always found that like one of those most very intriguing things, just like, how does the key actually get on the floor, and stuff like that, but the whole notion that Andy Colburn can't remember anything, I mean, absolutely nothing that he did that day, I mean, I think is garbage. I think he does. That's one of those few cases that he does remember exactly what he did, and it was that interview and that report was written in a way, to cover for him and stuff like that, whether Steer knew exactly what Andy did, or it's also possible, as I've seen in a lot of police corruption kind of cases, he doesn't want to know. It's like, you don't tell me what you don't want me to know, and we'll just leave it like that,
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember that in Eddie Murphy and Beverly Hills Cop or something like that.
Yeah.
So
your book, I was surprised that you kick off right away talking about Teresa. And some of it I was like, ooh, I mean, well, it's, we know this stuff that some people might get upset by, because they always feel like, don't attack the victim, or say anything, not that it was attacking the victim, but
sure.
saying anything that people would construe as being negative towards Teresa. And then there were Teresa's emails and those kinds of things. So how did you research Teresa and decide what you were going to put in the book about her?
Well, I also realized too that there's been numerous stories and reports that have kind of been a story about Teresa as far as just a human interest type of story, and I think those were all done, very respectfully, and tastefully, and I don't have any issue with that at all. But again, my approach of this book was looking at it from the investigation that was really never done, okay? And pretty much any good police department, as one of Zellner's experts, Greg McCurry, has talked about at length, points out in the affidavit, is that you need to do your research about the victim as far as to try to basically understand what was going on in their life around the time frame of their homicide. That's not blaming them or even saying anything that or judging. I'm not judging Teresa, and I don't think Zellner and Greg McCurry are either. It's just pointing out, here's the things that were going on in her life, to help guide in a competent, independent type of investigation, that wherever that would lead, whether that would lead to Steve Avery or whether that would lead to Bobby Dassey or somebody that we've never even heard about or talked about or stuff like that. It didn't matter. But the thing is that all of that was important information to try to get a sense as far as, who might be in a position to harm Teresa Halbach because of some of the risky, behavior / things she was involved with her business, because these things have happened all over the country. Is probably, hopefully, a lot of people on this, on this life will realize and stuff like that. There have been a number, of individuals that were involved in, in whatever you want to call it. But, that type of adult photography, whereas, the photographer comes to somebody's house where they get lured there and stuff like that, and that they get harmed, and you don't know what you don't know. So I mean, the fact that Teresa was involved, and again, here's another key point. Mark Wiegert, of all people, and Jerry Poggle. I mean, one of the first things that they were doing, shortly after she turned up missing, was they got wind or learned about that trunk, in her bedroom with the nude photographs of Bradley and his wife that were in the midst of that really ugly and messy divorce and stuff like that. So, I mean, so even Calumet County Sheriff's Office, before the case turned out the way that it did, that was one of the first darn things that they were even doing in the case. And I would say they were right for absolutely looking into that and stuff. And because we know, and they knew, that at the time that, she disappeared, that she was in the middle of this, nasty, contentious, divorce case. And then she winds up, falling in, love, or whatever you want to call it, but she had a relationship, with the ex, and then I think there was a protection order at one point in time involving, that guy and his wife and stuff like that. And so, I mean, it just, it made perfect sense, that would be investigated. And I don't understand, because I wasn't here 10 years ago. I don't know if this was not known to some of the journalists that were covering the case in Wisconsin 10 or 11 years ago. Or I also, and maybe it's possible that Kratz, in his side, just kind of put a lid on that and made sure that wasn't even, publicly disseminated and stuff like that. But I do think, though, that the way that Kratz portrayed, her is like that she only like photographed, weddings and, little kids and stuff like that. That's not accurate. And by portraying her that way, that kind of makes it, it takes away, from an honest assessment of, what her life was. And again, not judging her, not saying that it was wrong what she was doing. It was just that was her life. I mean, as Tom Pierce said in his affidavit, it was not uncommon for Teresa and Tom to have, different nude, clients come into the Green Bay photo studio and stuff like that for different types of poses and stuff like that, and there may have been other things that sound like that she was doing on her own, as far as, with other friends or people that she knew and stuff like that. Again, not judging her at all, but just pointing it out because, yeah, and if you're trying to get to the bottom of who the real killer is in this case, it could have easily been somebody connected in that type of world, and stuff like that. No different than how there's, people get murdered in the drug arena and stuff like that, over money and dope and stuff like that. So
yeah. And what do you think about the coroner not being allowed on salvage yard property? And do you think that is connected to the Ricky Hacksettler case?
I probably do, yeah, just because I know, yeah, I mean, I've talked with Debbie Kokich, over the years and stuff like that, and that's again one of those really important facts. I was glad that Make You a Murderer Part 2, brought that out. I know it was discussed about, at length a couple years ago and stuff, but I remember with Debbie with Deb Kokich, the former coroner, she actually knew Debbie Hostetler really well. They were friends, and so I mean that's one of the hard parts in the small town when you have a tragedy like this. Everybody kind of knows everybody. So I mean, so she's kind of breaking news to Deb Hostetler that about Ricky's death, and knowing Ricky already and stuff like that. But so I do think it would make sense, because why would you not bring in the Manitowoc County coroner? It's a Manitowoc County coroner's case. She's got no conflicts of interest. I mean, she's probably the only one that doesn't out of everybody, that was showing up at the scene and stuff like that. So that whole scenario, how that goes down, I mean, it just, the whole thing smells bad, and it makes you think that why would you go to those kinds of lengths? Why would you go to that kind of length to keep her out? And the only thing the logical scenario is that these guys, it was a good old boys network, and it was a small and tight group of good old boys that were kind of corralling the scene, controlling the scene, and they didn't want her, kind of throwing the turd in the punch bowl, so to speak, and they knew that if she knew what they probably knew, not only does the case fall apart against Steve Avery, but then that lawsuit probably adds another couple zeros to the end of it, But then also, I mean, they also would know that that she would be the type that would unmask them, that she would, go after these guys and probably, nail them to the wall for corruption and stuff like that. So I think because they're so untrustworthy, they didn't trust her because she's honest and righteous and does the right thing. And they didn't want somebody like that at the scene. And I always found it interesting on the flip side, let's just, for sake of argument, to say, okay, well, that if you were a dirty cop, that's classic, that's textbook, that makes sense they would do that. But I also found it interesting that they never brought Leslie Eisenberg, out to the scene, and she's up till then had no dog in the fight. And she would be somebody, if you actually think about it, she would kind of be naive. She wouldn't know the history of Manitowoc County, as far as the corruption or the Hostetler case or the Kenny Peterson running over Herzog, Gina Herzog, and stuff like that back in the 80s and stuff like that. So if anything, she would have been a perfect person to manipulate, as well. And the fact that they didn't even want her at the scene, kind of tells me that these guys really needed to kind of keep it close to the vest.
Yeah.
And they absolutely didn't trust. I don't know if it was just they didn't trust women or they didn't trust, these individuals. And I know they definitely didn't trust Deb Kokich, and I think it's exactly for the reason that you pointed out. They knew that she could really expose them, and that she knew, but couldn't prove probably, what really happened as far as the who, as far as, or wasn't in position to do anything about that, as far as Ricky Hostetler, when he was found dead in the middle of the county road out there then. Yeah. So.
What do you think about Scott and Bobby, and do you think Barb knows something?
As far as Scott and Bobby, well, the one thing that I always found kind of clear with Scott and Bobby is that those two always seem to kind of bond, that they kind of gelled together with each other, whereas the other Dassey brothers really didn't have anything to do with Scott. Definitely, and Brendan had absolutely nothing to do with him. So I always found that intriguing, that whole notion that, that Scott had gotten that phone call at the aluminum foundry, that's mentioned in those police reports about somebody calling up hysterical, calling the company. And in my mind, the first thing that jumped out at me, I'm like, well, wait a minute. That certainly wouldn't be Brendan. Brendan doesn't know the guy's phone number, and just knowing Brendan, that, so you could throw him out. So, and if you think about it, the only person in the case that would make sense to be doing that was really under pressure would have been Brendan. But then in reality, who else would do that? Somebody that might realize that, oh my gosh, we got to get our story straight, or, that they're taking my DNA right now at the hospital, they found scratches on my back. What do I say? Kind of scenario, those kinds of, people. And in my mind, who would be the most likely person to call Scott Todich at work would be, Bobby Dassey. So, and again, they talk about habits and, what their interests are. I mean, they're both outdoorsmen, and they both share a love of hunting. Okay. And that is probably a lot of people on, that are here tonight would already know that, hunters share a very common, bond and stuff like that. I've done a little bit of shooting over the years, but I am not a deer hunter at all. And it just, maybe it's because I lived in Illinois, in a part of Illinois that there's really not too much around here. Although I did kill a deer in 2016, but that was but a total at our van, in Wisconsin. So I did bag a deer once, but it destroyed our van. But that's another story for another day. But along those lines, what I was getting at is that those two guys shared a common bond, and then they also would have known and were really proficient at, skinning the deer, and taking it apart. And again, I know from having friends that are good deer hunters and stuff like that, and they're really good, at taking them apart and all that stuff. That's a precision. That's not just something that I or you or anybody off the street could do. You just have to have the skill set, and the precision to do something like that. And you're also totally fine with it. You could deal with a couple, bug eyes of a deer, looking, that are dead, that are, right in front of you, and chopping off the head and stuff like that. So again, we know that Teresa was dismembered, or at least I believe that I believe factually, that that's what happened to her and stuff like that. So then the question boils down to, who is more likely to do that type of activity? Somebody that's just completely, a virgin at that, like, me, you, or one of our, many listeners, or somebody that really, has that skill set, that precision, and has done that kind of stuff for years and years and stuff like that, And that's, again, where I kind of come back to that Steve Avery, in my opinion, and definitely Brendan Dassey, I just don't see those two individuals who really don't do much deer hunting, to have already had the skill set, and the cutlery, and the knives and the wherewithal, to do that and to do it under the time constraints that they would have been under and stuff like that, based on Ken Kratz's theory that he used at the trial and stuff like that. So again, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, these two seem to share a common bond, and probably the most important one and I'm sorry I even overlooked this, but the whole notion that these two guys have their stories straight. Oh, I mean, what was it? Just a few days after this happened, Bobby gets interviewed by Dietering, I think, and Mark Heimerl. I think I may have said his first name wrong. Kevin Heimerl. Yeah, that's right. From the Wisconsin DOJ. And they're asking him about, his activities, because he talks about seeing Teresa, and the whole, walking over to Steve's and all that kind of stuff. But he eventually starts talking about, they ask him what else, where he went and stuff like that. And he mentions that he, he's going one way on Highway 147, and Scott's going the other way. But then he tells them, oh, you got to go talk to Scott. Scott will tell you where we saw each other, and again, that's just one of those 1 in a million, probably even 1 in like a billion scenarios that, that people driving 55 miles an hour on the road going opposite directions that don't even know that they're going to, pass each other, because it's not like, Scott said, I'm coming home at 3:00 and Bobby had told him, hey, I'm going to be out and about, in the afternoon on Monday on Halloween, and stuff like that. So, I mean, the fact that these two supposedly would pass each other simultaneously and not know that they were going to pass each other, and then wave to each other, and then both of they were able to use that, as their alibi, is just, again, it looks to me like these guys have their stories put together. And I would say Scott, rather than Bobby, would be the more likely person as far as cooking that kind of scheme up and stuff like that. So
yeah. And can you give those of us that are not from the area or lived in the area, it just seems like everybody involved in this case is somehow connected. This one is a relative of that one. This one, it just seems like everybody in like Manitowoc Sheriff's Department, there's some multiple connections between, and even related to like judges and all that. Have you looked into that?
I know some of that. I'm trying to think here. I mean, some of the kind of the Shirtail Cousins stuff, I'm not as up on now as I probably was 2 years ago, in the early stages and stuff like that. Because I'm thinking just one popped in my head that I haven't researched for a while. But I think Jason Yost, Jost, I think that somehow, I'm trying to remember what in some of the, people could jump in and tell me exactly what it was, but I think it was, somehow he's related to the Hallbucks, or his wife is, maybe it's his wife is, or something like that. I think, those kinds of scenarios, but yeah, you get, and I don't again know if it was just the small town angle and stuff like that, but you do get a lot of those connections that kind of overlap. I mean, for example, and some of these are smaller ones, but like Dennis Jacobs, the famous, I would say infamous, investigator that we remember from Making a Murderer Part 1, that was the one where he's showing up to work, he's rolling into the sheriff's office on Saturday morning and, asking, hey, do we got Steve Avery in custody yet? And he's the only guy in this whole case. I always found this really interesting and never really did a whole lot with it because there was so many other angles. And maybe it's been talked about, but I think Dennis Jacobs was the only guy in the whole case from Manitowoc County standpoint, or a detective standpoint, that wrote down zero, nothing. Although I should say Mike Bushman too, for that matter. But both of those guys, but Jacobs was a full-time employee though, whereas Bushman came out of retirement to do what he did, as I pointed out in Wrecking Crew. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, Jacobs. So his brother was at the same time was a city of Manitowoc police officer. Again, I have no evidence that his brother was involved in anything, and I said before, and I'll still say it, I think the city police department is on the up and up, at least compared to Manitowoc County. But again, it's just there's all those connections, and I think here's why those little connections, even like the Jacobs, matter, because the city cops in this case, because of those kinds of connections, they're not going to squeal, and rat these guys out. Whereas in other cases I've had around the country, it's not uncommon to have a couple, what would you say, rats jump ship, so to speak, or whatever, or not even the rats, but somebody good in that department, somebody honorable that says, I can't work for a crappy, I can't, look my wife and kids in the mirror, knowing that I work at a place like this, and that I'm allowing, that I know that there's corruption, and I know there's evidence being planted and manipulated and stuff like that. I'm just going to keep my mouth, my lips zipped and keep my head down and just do my job and not say anything about it. I mean, in the case I told you about before, the one in Nebraska that was my first book, Bloody Lies, ultimately it was a CSI that worked at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office that she became an informant for the FBI, because she had long-standing suspicions about her boss, that he was finding all this miraculous blood evidence in strange and odd and unorthodox places, that was kind of save the day type of evidence, where it would show up months into the case. Oh, kind of like our hood latch DNA, in this case, and the bullet, in the garage. But that's what I'm saying. Those things don't normally happen. So when they happen, you got to step back and say, is this really legitimate, or is this just, complete BS, and that's what I'm saying. In my case in Nebraska, you had a woman that worked at the sheriff's office that eventually, worked out she agreed to help the FBI, and she helped make their case, although they made their case themselves. But you had somebody like that. And as far as I know, as we're having this conversation tonight, I'm just not aware, that somehow, that there's been some detective from the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office or somebody at the city that somehow, wearing a wiretap or just even, going to the, the feds with their suspicions of what they know. Because oftentimes on cases like this or others, if people have been involved in, in high level corruption, as far as planting evidence and fabricating evidence, there's a chance they're doing it on small stuff too, cases that are really, mundane, that you and I would, and our, viewers tonight would never even talk about. I mean, small stuff like a drunken driving conviction or a small amount of, weed or coke or something like that. And that's kind of what happened with this CSI out of Nebraska. It turned out that he was also fabricating fingerprint evidence too, on cases where he was basically making it seem like he was finding fingerprints, latent prints off of guns, when all he was really doing is making sure that he had the suspect's fingerprints, and he was just basically claiming that he was finding their fingerprints on evidence. And again, these weren't high profile cases with the guns, but he was doing this to kind of impress all these other cops from these other towns, to kind of make himself known as, that he's this latent fingerprint expert and stuff like that. So
yeah,
it's just important to think about,
Right. So do you think it was Bobby?
I mean, as of right now, if I were, I can't say with 100% confidence, but as of right now, if we're having this conversation, he's at the top. He's at the top. He's probably my number one logical suspect, unless somehow, you're able to eliminate him, or Zellner's able to eliminate him. I think he makes the most sense, because of the standpoint that he sees her, he's watching her, he's at the time that she's last seen alive. And then secondly, that her remains turn up in his burn barrel. So for those two main reasons, that's kind of why I give him way, way, way more scrutiny than Orion Hilligus or Scott Blodorn or George Zipper or Bradley Checker, whoever else people want to talk about and stuff like that. Because again, just kind of keep it simple, stupid kind of method and stuff like that, that you got him basically doing exactly what Michael Boyd did in the Ryan Ferguson case, as I mentioned earlier. But I'm doing that to, to stress that point, is that you have a witness that goes out of his way, unintentionally, but basically puts himself, at the scene or around the scene of the crime / abduction / disappearance. And then lo and behold, what do we have? But we have, her remains. And again, she's dismembered, she's burned, and he also happens to get a deer off of the street, off of the road a few days later, and again, I'll mention this because we talked about it a little while ago, but I mean, the last thing I was even thinking about when I hit that deer in May of 2016, we were on our way to Iowa, actually, but we were going for a family get together, and it was actually on Interstate 90, and I hit the damn thing going 70 miles an hour. And it was around noontime. It was actually like 11:30, and the damn thing just ran right out of the what do you call it? The bushes or whatever on the side of the road there, and just ran right into the front of my vehicle, and then just kind of went into that huge median area, that they had there. But the last thing I was thinking about doing was, tell my wife and kids that, hey, that, that's a couple £100 worth of meat we could take with us and stuff. Yeah, let's get a tag for this thing and take it with us. So I mentioned that just now, just to kind of give people perspective and context about what's the likelihood then that, I mean, who's going to go drive around their the back roads and the gravel roads or whatever and pick up a dead deer off the side of the road and take it home with them, especially when Bobby's a deer hunter to begin with, And I mean, the idea that he's going to pick up roadkill off the road, and he's, I mean, not going to know the ins and outs as far as like who hit the thing and like and what kind of, I mean, crap might be in the thing and stuff like that. The notion that you're going to take that thing home, and then string it up in your garage and then eat that, it just, if you do that 3 times a week, I could say, then I would kind of give him more credibility and saying, okay, that's just who he is. And there's a pattern there. Okay. But I'm not aware that there's any pattern that this was something that he did, for the last 3 years of his life and stuff like that. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. I mean, just look at the chronology of this case.
Right.
By that point in time, word was out, the news media was showing up around Avery Road, he knew that Steve was under suspicion, but he also probably didn't know whether the cops were completely, had they backed off Steve, his uncle, and if they had, well, who's going to be next? They're going to probably look at everybody in the family, Earl, Chuck, and he and all his brothers and stuff like that, So again, what better way has been, talked about already. But I mean, if you're going to cover up stuff, you might as well, do it well and do it often. And again, throwing a deer up, stringing that thing up in the middle of your garage it was kind of spooky looking, but it also would tell a couple, naive, slash incompetent investigators, oh, this is somebody's, deer. I mean, they wouldn't know the facts even. They wouldn't stop and say, immediately, they eventually question them, but they're not going to immediately step back and say, oh, this deer must be here because maybe this is the scene of where the body, either the person was actually killed or dismembered, and stuff like that. And the deer would be a great thing to, put over it. Right. They're not going to be thinking that way. So, again, and well, who would do that kind of stuff? Well, I mean, again, that pattern that I was talking about, people, the 2 guys that pass each other on, on the highway that say they see each other, right around the same time that this is all going down, I mean, just have all these little things that just kind of add up and add up and add up, and they all kind of go back to Bobby and Scott. So, I mean, sometimes circumstantial evidence, as the special prosecutor told me in Nebraska, he said sometimes he likes a case with really strong, striking circumstantial evidence, even more so than just a case with flat out physical evidence and stuff like that. So, because as a prosecutor, it's challenging, but then when you really connect the dots, it's really fun, and rewarding. So,
yeah. What's your thoughts on Ryan Hilgas? Because, he looks shady. A lot of people like him as suspect number 1, getting in and erasing her voicemails, having the day planner, the search party, him giving Pam of God, the direct line to Poggle. And, there's just so much with Ryan Hilgas. What do you think of him and where he fits in?
I mean, he would kind of fall under the original theory that you would always look at people that are closest to, somebody that disappears or a victim and stuff like that. So, I mean, it makes sense to really hone in on him, but I kind of backed away again from him based on some of those other scenarios that I just don't. He doesn't seem the type of guy to me that would be sitting out there with a, with a saw or a butcher knife or cleaver or something like that, and just hacking up her body left and right and stuff like that, and being able to do that. I just I don't see that. And again, the other thing I have with him that kind of backs me off of him too is just the location too. If she met her, if she was harmed somewhere in a short distance from Avery Road, um, there's nothing that I'm aware of that directly would place Ryan, over at Highway 147 and Q Road or something like that afternoon. But like I said, I never completely eliminate him for the same points that you mentioned, just because he acts weird, and he never goes out of his way. He's never wanted to clear his name, with Zellner or Buting or Strang or the media. I called him one time a couple of years ago, and he was just he tried to come off as polite, but it was just that that he basically said he had nothing to say, didn't even want to refute the allegations at that point in time, when people were calling him saying that he was the most logical suspect. But on the other side of the coin, though, I still think that it's very much possible and probable, even, that somehow that he's involved in, he either knows that the vehicle where it's found and helps facilitate moving it, or is intimately involved in actually doing that and stuff like that. So either way, he's kind of, involved, in what would you call it, the conspiracy, as far as just to make sure that the Averys or Steve Avery, would get blamed for the crime and stuff like that. So I've often thought that even though it may be less that he's not the person responsible for the crime, but that he's involved in, he's kind of the doer of the deed as far as helping move the vehicle or working with Colburn possibly to do that. So, but if I didn't know, if Bobby Dassey never existed, if Scott Tadich never existed, I would put him at, definitely toward the top. But again, I would still be struggling right now, with that same issue I just talked about, that you to really kind of advance it, you'd have to find some evidence or find something that really puts him either around the scene of the crime or where she disappears, or something else that really ties it to him, because otherwise, it's just, a lot of it's just speculating that, that because he wrote something in his, yearbook about women being evil, that somehow that makes him, as much as it's goofy and strange, I mean, but I just, in my mind, that doesn't elevate him to somehow being a murder suspect and stuff like that. But if I was Zellner, though, and her people, though, I would still keep putting pressure on him, because if he didn't commit the crime and has no involvement in the crime, then in my mind, he could be one of those persons that could be very helpful to her to kind of get to the bottom of what really happened as far as the planting and the evidence goes. So he could really still, if he was involved in that, he could rehabilitate, his reputation, by going to her and telling her, here's what really happened. And by the way, I was put in a jam, I didn't know what to do, and these cops told me this is what I needed to do, because they told me that Steve Avery was guilty of sin, and this is what and I mean, I could see that kind of scenario possibly have really happened, back 12 years ago or whatever, 13 years ago, and him kind of being swept up in that, thinking that, he's doing the right thing, by getting a guilty person off the street or taking him away, when he really didn't know what we know now and stuff like that. But I've always thought that he could still, if he was involved in, helping move the vehicle, or knowing the vehicle was going to be planted on the property, and that's how, Pam got there and stuff like that, because he basically told her, that he could still do the right thing as far as come forward, to Zellner or her investigators and tell them, here's how it really went down, basically give a real accounting of what happened those last 24 hours of his life, between Pam Sturm showing up late, very late that morning after everybody else had already showed up on time, because, if you're going to really participate in a search, you're going to show up on time. You're not going to show up, an hour late or whenever the hell she showed up and stuff like that, because that just, it just defies logic, and also basically sends a message to me that the whole thing was a setup, as far as she knew that she needed she was basically told, when to show up, and and then she could have the private conversation with Ryan and Scott, and they could kind of take things from there and stuff like that. So but I think, yeah.
Have you ever found, because people always wonder if Ryan Hilgess knew Bobby or, anybody from the salvage yard, if there's ever been any kind of connection there?
I don't think so. I'm not aware of any. I remember at one point in time back like 2 years ago, I looked into like Redant, like in Hilgess, I think there was some talk that maybe those two guys knew each other from like a basketball league, or or a Y Rec league or something like that. And I can't remember if that was ever proven, or maybe they just played on a, they may have been in like a regional league or something like that, that they were, but you couldn't put them on the same team and stuff like that. And then, I believe now in my heart that Josh Redan had nothing to do with the case and stuff like that. So, but at one point in time, I was trying to spend a lot of time, I know, looking at the possibility that maybe these two guys teamed up somehow, that maybe Ryan's the killer, and, Josh, he hooked up with Josh to kind of move the vehicle through or something like that. But no, I'm not. I don't think I ever found any direct connection between Ryan and any of the Dassies, and I, part of it I think may have just been the age difference too. I think Ryan will be about 3 or 4 years older than even most all the Dassies and stuff like that. So, but that being said, though, I mean, it's still worthwhile. I mean, if people that are here tonight, I mean, that still could be a logical angle to pursue and stuff like that. Because sometimes it's good to rule these things out too, because then we don't have to spin our wheels, or chase down things that, we could come back to people and say, no, we've looked into this. But as of right now, I'm not aware of any connection that somehow puts these two as, hanging out, going hunting together, or anything like that. So,
what about Mike Osmondson? What do you know on him, and do you think there's any connection there?
Honestly, that's probably, out of all the key people in the case, he's probably, and I don't even know what I should call him key, but he's one that I've spent probably the least amount of time on, and that might be to my fault, actually, just because I, spent a lot of time looking at Scott and Bobby, and then trying to understand and dissect the evidence. So he really hadn't worked into any of the key documents over the last year or two, but that doesn't mean that somehow that he's not, on the circular level, as far as that he has an overlap because of his connection with Bobby and stuff. So I'll be kind of curious to see, as we move forward with the appeals, to see how he fits into the case, as far as, is he, will he eventually become cooperative with Zellner, and or what does he have to know? I mean, the one little thing obviously I know is that, he and Bobby are super tight, and they were super tight at that point in time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that somehow that in the event that Bobby even did the crime, that somehow he spilled his guts to him or had him involved in stuff like that. But it does, just like, anything, you're going to look into the key people that are familiar with them, and just like you would ask questions about Teresa Hilgess. I'm sorry, Teresa Hallbeck, and Ryan Hilgess and stuff like that. It would make sense that you would want to ask questions and learn more about, about people that are part of Bobby Dassey's life and routine, around this time of the crime. And Mike Osmondson definitely would be, I always found that intriguing that, he was never called in the trial, right? I don't think he ever testified, right?
I don't recall him testifying, no.
Yeah. His name kind of gets overlapped, and then there's like rumors about, he said this, and it's like then it's like double, triple hearsay. So it's kind of I never really understood exactly what he either said or people said to him, other than repeating rumors. And I always get careful about like the game of telephone, and just like a double.
Yeah.
I said something to you, but then three people from now that you talk to repeat it back and stuff like that. So
Right.
so it's but I would think though that I mean, the one thing I guess my question would be, does Mike Osmondson know more than he's ever come forward, and said or shared? I think that's a fair question, and that's one that's kind of been on my mind. Has he been kind of laying low, so to speak, because he doesn't want to get dragged into the case, and I think that's a legitimate question. I think it's no different
Right.
than asking questions about Scott Blodorn, for that matter. So.
Right. And any predictions on what will be in Zellner's filing on Thursday?
That's that's right. Yeah, that'll be coming up a week from now, right?
Yeah.
The I think my thoughts on that is, obviously it's a different level. I mean, she's obviously trying to get to be successful as far as getting an evidentiary hearing, which I mean, one would think that based on everything she's already turned in, would have gotten more than a 5-page response from Angie Suckowitz the first time around. But I would think that Zellner's motion would be, this one should be more precise and concise, as far as that she'll kind of buckle down, so to speak, as far as kind of really hone in on certain areas or certain evidence or items that she deserves or believes that she's entitled to finally get access to testing, and or lay out a convincing argument to the Court of Appeals why certain items of in the case warrant or met the criteria as far as the Brady violations go and stuff like that. So but I'm like you and everybody else that's on here, until she actually files it, I mean, what I might have just said right now could be the exact opposite of what she actually does file. And that's, I think, what's kind of fun, and exciting about Zellner and stuff like that, that she's very unpredictable, I mean, and she's not afraid to kind of back off, of the theory. She doesn't really lock in on something, and just, become stubborn or bullheaded about it and stuff like that. She's constantly, challenging herself, challenging her own theories and stuff like that. And most importantly, she's putting them to the test and stuff like that, So, and I think that's, again, this case is really, it's so much about scientific evidence, and proving that the scientific evidence that was used the first time around, was all phony, and to do that, you could only really do it the way that she's done it so far. And that's to bring in, people that are at the top of their game, in every specific area, and that they're willing to put their name and reputation on the line in front of the world, because again, if somehow somebody on, outgoing Brad Schimmel's side, came back and said, I mean, then they could be proven wrong, but they've all individually come back and looked at so many different specific pieces of evidence and said, well, not only is this wrong, but here's why it's wrong, And I think out of all the ones that kind of jump out at me, the Q-tips or, the swabs, the hood latch swabs, that makes the most sense as far as what she's uncovered, because that's what that guy did in Nebraska and I even mentioned it briefly in Wrecking Crew. That's the way you plant evidence, that you don't actually manually open up the trunk, or I'm not the trunk, but the hood, back at the sheriff's office on, whatever that day was, April of 2006, and wipe, Steve's DNA or whatever it is onto a swab there. You already have it in your stash, basically, and all you do is just substitute, an extra piece of evidence that you already have collected, and that's what you do and stuff like that. And that's what the guy did in Nebraska, and he was going into the car too. He claimed he found some DNA, blood DNA of the murder victim underneath the dashboard, of the suspect's getaway car that had already been searched for 8 hours, several times, or I mean, for several hours. I mean, and there was nothing in the car. I mean, even though this was a bloody, very bloody crime scene, in Nebraska, he goes back a week or two later and then claims that he's searching certain areas of the car that they had missed the first time around. And lo and behold, like the only spot in the car that he decides to check underneath the dashboard, he claims he finds, a DNA, blood DNA of the murder victim. And it was the same thing like we had here, in Steve Avery's case. It was like a perfect DNA specimen. It wasn't like even a partial DNA, it was like the most potent, type of DNA. It was a 16 out of 16, as far as the, on the, what do they call it? The PSR method and stuff like that.
Yeah.
As far as the DNA. So anyway, so I could probably just go a few more minutes.
Right. I was going to ask you final question right now.
Yeah.
So final question is, would you be writing a follow-up to Wrecking Crew about Stephen's case, and where do you think you would focus on in a sequel?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've thought about, but I haven't thought about it. It's kind of one of those things that I just got this, published a month ago or whatever, and I think yes, if there's if something happened real quickly, like in the next 3 months, then the question would be, do I just want to update this book, and add a couple of chapters or rewrite it, but I would say if something dramatic happens, and by dramatic, I mean, charges being dismissed, Zellner winning an evidentiary hearing that the state basically kind of waves the white flag and says we're dropping the case against him. I think that's what's going to that would have to happen for me to do a follow-up book, at this point in time, because I don't want to do a book 20 years or 15 years from now that says Steve Avery dies in prison at age 74. That would really hurt, I don't know. So it's like I said, it just, you would, if I do a book, I want it to be along the lines of that it's going to be, something earth-shattering next, because I did think this book was worthwhile. I thought that it was important to put together a book because nobody had really done that yet. We've had all the Kratz and Griesbach books and, those kinds of pieces out there. And I don't begrudge them for doing those things. They could do what they want, but I wanted to do a book that, shows that, here's the country's best wrongful conviction lawyer, and here's how she's not just going up against them, but she's going up against the whole state of Wisconsin, Democrats and Republicans, and they don't want her to be successful, and it's obvious based on the standpoint that Suckowitz wrote that 5 or 6 page opinion, when Zellner's turned in thousands of pages of documents and exhibits. My kids could write a 5-page school report, in an hour or so. That's basically probably about the amount of time she put in there. And as I point out in the book, the fact that she called Brandon, in her ruling just shows me how big of an idiot, that she is, as far as she doesn't take the case seriously and stuff like that, and she probably felt under pressure, and could have been, maybe someday we'll see her get appointed to a higher position, but just it seemed like she was taking one for the team. And as I said last week, I would respect her if she had come back with a ruling like Judge Duffin did, where it's 85 pages and it's really well thought out and says, no, I'm sorry, but here's why, Kathleen Zellner is wrong. But you could tell that the way that she wrote that thing, she just basically overlooked any and all the key arguments that were made by Zellner and just didn't even touch them. So the fact that she doesn't even really address them, in my mind, just tells me that, Zellner just kind of, she drew the, what would you call it? She drew the short straw or whatever,
right.
Yeah. So, but that being said, I don't know. I really don't know. We don't know right now, right? As far as which judges on the Court of Appeals are going to get this case, correct?
Right. No, we don't.
So, I think once we get to that point, I think that'll at least give us a better idea. But again, she's won a lot of her cases on the Court of Appeals and or at the Supreme Court level and stuff like that. So, I wouldn't want to predict she's going to lose at this level. But in the event, even if she did, I mean, she's won a lot of her cases at the Supreme Court level and stuff like that. So it just depends on, again, what she's able to put in this motion, in her filing that's coming up next week, and then whether or not those judges, that get the case, are going to be able to step back and say, we're not, we're not, we're going to put aside our whatever impact this case is going to have on Wisconsin, the state's reputation, or whatever. We're going to do the right thing and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's what, judges are supposed to be judges to interpret the law, and make decisions that are based on what's in front of them, rather than trying to save somebody's reputation or make sure that something really bad doesn't come out and stuff like that. So it just it'll be interesting, because again, as I pointed out earlier, as we talked about before, in my mind, one of the most important things is that little disc, the compact disc that Ken Kratz and Tom Fassbender decided, we can't let Jerry Buting and Dean Strang have this thing. I mean, they decided that there's no way, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the only reason why they would do this is because they thought Jerry and Dean were smart enough, that they were gonna, watch that and have a conversation, and say, hey, wait a minute, did you see what I just saw, or run to each other's house or whatever, and Making Murder Part 1 would have probably had a different ending to it, and it would turn out differently had those guys had access to that and stuff like that, but they didn't, so and there's a reason for that. And again, that falls in line with the kind of guy Ken Kratz is and stuff like that. He would be the kind of a snake in the grass, that would do something like that. You agree? I mean, does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, so if he's willing to do that, then isn't it also, make sense that some of these other pieces of evidence that showed up, late in the game, the hood latch DNA, and the bullet, in the garage and stuff like that, I mean, that he may not have been directly involved, in that, but again, it's kind of like, don't tell me what happened, like I mentioned earlier with Gary Steer, he doesn't want to know what Andy Colbert was really doing on Friday, November 4th, on his day off of work and stuff like that. You just tell me what you want me to write down, and I'll write it down, and we'll leave it at that. Like that.
Well,
so
in closing, can you tell people where they can get Wrecking Crew, and then is there anything else that you want to promote?
Well, I would just say, again, for everybody that hasn't had a chance to read Wrecking Crew yet, we got it available in 3 different formats. One is paperback, and actually I looked up, if somebody wanted to order it right now at the second or whatever, I saw Barnes & Noble actually has it like $3 cheaper on their website than what it is on Amazon. It's kind of like, I just stumbled across that, but, or at least I should say, as of yesterday, it was like $13 on Barnes & Noble. And it's regularly, I think, $16.99, and Amazon has it marked down to like $15.10 or 20 cents or whatever. So I mean, it's still like 10% off on Amazon. But again, it seems like, I mean, if somebody wanted to save money or whatever, save a couple bucks, which is Noble. But Barnes and Noble had it cheaper. But everybody else, again, Kindle, which most people have nowadays.
Yeah.
And it's cheaper that way too. I think regular price is $8.99, which is pretty comparable, and probably even $1 or $2 cheaper, frankly, than a lot of true crime, books that are out there. So I think it's $8.99 regular on Kindle. And then Kevin Pierce, who's probably one of the most well-known audiobook narrators for true crime, he did Wrecking Crew for us, and I know a lot of people have the sales for that have gone really well, and I've had a lot of people mention to me and comment that they like his voice. I think Kevin's probably in his, and I'm guessing now, I'd say he's mid to late 50s or so, but he's got a real soothing voice and stuff like that. And I've actually had a lot of people that bought the paperback, backwards. But anyway, the paperback for Wrecking Crew, and and then go out and get the audio version of it and stuff like that too, just to have listen to his him kind of tell the story. So, but again, Amazon's probably the easiest place, and everybody has access to that. And most people nowadays have an account, and all these all three of them are available through Wild Blue Press. That's where I've had my last, I think 4 books have all been published through Wild Blue Press, which also has a lot of other real good true crime books, as well coming out. And then I would just say again, Failure of Justice, which was my last book, and that came out 2.5 years ago. That's probably the most, if you want to understand wrongful conviction cases and how they happen, and also on the opposite side, a wrongful conviction case that you actually have the state of Nebraska get involved in and actually bring in a task force, set up a task force while the case was still going on, and it was politically, controversial for them to even do this because it was a case that was 20, 25 years old, that most people had already assumed that, hey, the guilty people were, some of them actually pled guilty to the crime, even though they were innocent, believe it or not. But this would actually give you kind of a roadmap of how, if everything happened, in Steve Avery's case and Brendan Dassey's case, the way that you and most everybody here believes happened, this is the way it should play out. It did play out in Nebraska, with a false confession case, involving multiple people. So it's the biggest wrongful conviction case of the country. 3 men, 3 women, they went to prison. Wow. For a murder of a 68-year-old widow that was raped in her apartment, at like 4 a.m, in her apartment, on the coldest day of the year and stuff like that. So it's an unbelievable story, and if people think that Mark Wiegert and Tom Fassbender, are something else, then wait till you read about Bert Searcy. That's all I'm going to say. So,
well, I want to thank you so much for taking time out and talking with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Like I said, I thought your book was excellent. And I've told everybody, whether or not you're new to the case, old to the case, this is the book that you should get that really lays it all out there. That's easy for people to read and follow along with. So I appreciate you coming on tonight. You ever want to come back on again?
Yeah.
And then I'll leave you with one plug. Now that you're here in Illinois, another one of Kathleen's cases, Melissa Kaluzinski, you need to write a book on her case.
That's a good one too, actually. Yeah, I know the general ins and outs of it, but yeah, again, it's one that I haven't dissected yet. But
her dad
asked me to. Not a bad idea.
Her dad asked me to mention that to you before you.
Oh, okay.
That
okay.
The family is really open to it, so I can put you in contact with them if you would like.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. Yeah, definitely. Reach out to me on that. And one small thing I just thought of, it's a real small thing as far as anybody that does, if you do have an opportunity to read Wrecking Crew, it really helps if you're able to leave a review on Amazon. And sometimes it only takes you 5 minutes to do that. But again, nowadays it's more about numbers and kind of rankings and stuff like that. So, I mean, trust me, Wrecking Crew has done phenomenal over the last month or so. But again, it's like, we all want the story. I did this because I want to get the story out there, and I want to tell the story from Kathleen's perspective, and shed, and help people understand Stephen, and Brendan. And I think, again, it's important that if people do read the book, if you can make 5 minutes of your time to go on Amazon and, give it a ranking, and then just, throw a couple sentences in there. Because, again, there are so many people out there that a week from now, a month from now, 2 months from now, they're not going to be on this discussion, thread tonight. They're not going to have ever heard me on any of the podcasts or any of the shows, and some of them, believe it or not, they're going to be first timers just coming to Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, on the Facebook pages. And they're just going to stumble across Making a Murder over the Christmas holidays and stuff like that, and and it's logical that they're going to, search out, see what books are out there, and they're going to have choices, they're going to see John Ferak's got a book, and they're also going to see Ken Kratz's got a book.
Yeah.
Right. And we want them to read, an honest story, and I would say, yeah, definitely. I mean, and if you don't read my book, take a look at Jerry Buting's book, or, Illusion of Justice or something like that then too. So.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's Christmas, like you said, so it's a good stocking stuffer. So people should buy several copies and pass them out, and then make sure those people do reviews too.
Mm-hmm. Good idea. Good idea. So anyway, but I want to thank you very much for having me on. And like I said, I hope this was informative for everybody that has been with us tonight. And like I said, if there's a question or two that we didn't get a chance to talk to, hopefully they could let you know, and I'll try to respond if I can make the time in the coming days.
Well, thank you so much, and you have a good evening.
You too. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Good night.